I knew Vanessa Halbrook had gone too far the moment I saw the brand new steel padlock hanging on the door of my own well house. Beside it hung a laminated sign with the Briar Glen Estates logo, and underneath it, in bold letters, it said, "Authorized personnel only." She was standing on the other side of the fence with her arms crossed, telling me that from now on the Homeowners Association would be managing the water supply for the good of the community. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice. I just took a photograph of the lock, checked the time on my phone, and called my lawyer. 2 days later, the fire chief drove out to inspect the hydrant system, looked at the pipe map, looked at the locked door on my property, and asked Vanessa a single question that she never expected to have to answer. Where exactly does your hydrant system get its water? If you enjoy watching people like Vanessa Halbrook dig their own hole with nothing but arrogance and a padlock, stick around, because this one gets good fast. The whole thing started on an ordinary morning near the end of summer. I drove out to the well house the way I did most weeks, planning to check the pressure on the irrigation line before the heat really set in. My family has owned 60 acres on the edge of Briar Glen Estates since before that subdivision existed, and the well sits close to the property line, tucked behind a stand of old oaks that my grandfather planted decades ago. When I pulled up that morning, the door was already locked, and not with the simple padlock my father had used for 30 years. Someone had installed an industrial lock, the kind you'd expect on a shipping container, and bolted a new hasp straight into the frame. For a moment, I actually thought it was some kind of prank, maybe kids from the new development messing around where they shouldn't be. Then I heard the whir of an electric golf cart, and Vanessa Halbrook came rolling up the gravel path like she owned the place. She told me the board had voted to take control of security around what she called the shared water infrastructure. I reminded her, calmly, that this was my well house, built on my land, paid for by my family. She looked at me the way you'd look at a stray dog that had wandered too close to a nice house. "That well serves more than 100 homes, Caleb," she said. "It isn't just yours anymore. That line is the one people usually remember, because it tells you everything about how Vanessa saw the world. In her mind, need created ownership. If enough people depended on something, the person who actually held the deed became irrelevant." She explained that the Briar Glen hydrant system pulled from a line that ran off my well, and because so many houses relied on that connection, the association believed it had the authority to secure it however it saw fit. I told her that using water under certain conditions was completely different from seizing control of the building that housed the pump. She waved that off like it was a technicality invented by lawyers with too much time on their hands. I asked her for a key. She refused. She actually warned me that if I cut the lock myself, the association would treat it as interference with the community safety system, as if I were the one threatening people's lives instead of the other way around. I didn't cut anything. I stood there in the heat, photographed the lock from 3 angles, recorded a short video with a timestamp, and noted the exact wording on that laminated sign before I got back in my truck. Then I called Nora Bellamy, a real estate attorney, who had handled a boundary dispute for a neighbor of mine a few years earlier, and who I trusted to tell me the truth even when it wasn't what I wanted to hear. When I described what had happened, Nora didn't waste time on outrage. She asked me one very specific question. Did I still have the original water agreement my father signed with the developer all those years ago? I told her I did, that it was sitting in a fireproof box in the house along with the deed and the old survey maps. She told me not to touch that lock, not to cut it, not to argue with Vanessa again until she'd read every word of that document herself. Something about the calm in her voice made it clear she already suspected there was more to this than a disagreement about a fence line. Before I even got to the folder, I spent a good hour just standing in the yard, looking at that lock from a distance, Trying to understand the kind of person who thinks locking someone out of their own property is a reasonable first move rather than a last resort. I'd known Vanessa for years, mostly in passing, the way you know anyone who runs a homeowners association a few hundred yards from your fence line. She'd always struck me as someone who mistook confidence for correctness, the kind of person who assumed that speaking with authority was the same thing as actually having it. I didn't hate her for that. I just knew, standing there in the heat, that reasoning with her directly wasn't going to get me anywhere. That night I pulled the folder out and spread the pages across the kitchen table. The agreement had been signed roughly 14 years earlier, back when Briar Glen Estates was still nothing but cleared lots and construction trailers. At the time, the county water system in that corner of the county didn't have enough pressure to guarantee fire protection for a development that size, and the builder needed a temporary solution before the city could extend its lines out that far. My father's well was strong, deep, and close enough to make sense as a stopgap. He agreed to let the developer tap into it to keep a fire reserve tank full while the permanent infrastructure caught up. The terms were laid out in plain language, and I read them twice just to be sure I wasn't imagining things that weren't there. The well remained private property, full stop. The Homeowners Association, or whoever eventually took over from the developer, was never given the right to change the locks or block the landowner's access. The water could only be used for fire suppression and routine system testing, nothing else. No irrigation for common areas, no filling decorative ponds, nothing like that. And critically, the whole arrangement was designed to be temporary, meant to expire once Briar Glen secured a permanent, independent water supply of its own. There was a line near the bottom of the second page that stuck with me longer than the rest, a clause stating plainly that the right to draw water under this agreement shall not, under any circumstances, be construed as a transfer of ownership, title, or exclusive control of the well house, or any associated equipment. My father had underlined that sentence himself, in pencil, faded now but still legible if you held the page at the right angle under the kitchen light. He must have known, even back then, that someday somebody would try to stretch the meaning of that agreement further than it was ever meant to go. It felt strange, sitting there 14 years later, watching his handwriting prove him right. I called Nora back the next morning and read her the relevant sections over the phone. She asked me the obvious question before I even finished. If Briar Glen already had city water running to every house in that neighborhood, why would their fire hydrants still need my well at all? I didn't have an answer, and neither did she, not yet. She drafted a formal letter to the association demanding 3 things. Remove the new lock immediately. Stop interfering with my access to the well house. And produce whatever documentation they believed gave them authority to claim any kind of ownership or operational control over equipment sitting on my land. Vanessa responded faster than I expected, and there wasn't an ounce of apology in it. She didn't remove the lock. She didn't even acknowledge that the well house belonged to me in the first place. Instead, she wrote back, claiming the association had inherited operational rights from the original developer when Briar Glen transitioned to homeowner control years earlier. She went a step further and sent a formal notice, stating that I was not permitted to enter the well house without a designated association representative present, as if I needed permission to walk onto my own property. For me, that was close to the final straw. But Nora kept telling me to hold steady. Let her keep writing, she said. The more Vanessa put in writing, the more precisely she was going to define exactly what the association believed it was entitled to, and every word of it could eventually be used against her. While I waited, I went back through years of old maintenance records my father had kept in a separate binder, mostly out of habit rather than any real plan. One detail jumped out at me almost immediately. For more than a decade, The association had been quietly paying the electric bill for what the records called the auxiliary fire pump, which told me the old backup system had never actually been decommissioned the way I assumed it had. I pulled out an aging site diagram that had come with the original agreement and traced the piping with my finger. A red line ran directly from my well to the fire reserve tank inside Briar Glen Estates. From that tank, the same line branched outward, connecting to what looked like nearly every hydrant in the development. It wasn't a small detail buried in some footnote. It was the backbone of their entire fire protection plan, and somehow, after 14 years, almost nobody living in that neighborhood seemed to know it existed. In the meantime, I kept living my life the way I always had, because letting a dispute like this take over every hour of my day would have meant handing Vanessa a second kind of victory she hadn't earned. I fed the cattle in the mornings, checked fence lines in the afternoons, and tried not to think too hard about the sign hanging on my well house every time I drove past it on the way to the far pasture. It sat there for 11 days before the lock finally came off, and every single one of those days, I made a point of photographing it again, just to have a clean record of exactly how long the association had kept me from my own equipment without so much as a phone call. Nora suggested I talk to Dean Whitaker, a retired water systems engineer who had actually worked on the original Briar Glen infrastructure design back when the subdivision was first being built. Dean was in his 60s now, semi-retired, spending most of his time consulting on smaller municipal projects, but he remembered the Briar Glen job well enough to meet me for coffee within a couple of days. When I laid the old site diagram on the table in front of him, his expression changed almost immediately, and I could tell he was recalculating something in his head that he hadn't thought about in years. Dean confirmed that Briar Glen had eventually connected to the regional water main, just as everyone assumed. But the pressure available from that main at that particular location was only ever sufficient for ordinary household use, showers, sprinklers, washing machines, that sort of thing. To meet the flow requirements for fire suppression in certain scenarios, especially during peak demand or a major structure fire, the development still depended on a combination of a reserve tank, a booster pump, and that supplemental line running straight from my well. Without my well feeding that tank, he said, the hydrants wouldn't necessarily run bone dry, but he wouldn't want to be the engineer signing off that they'd still hit their designed flow rate, not without serious testing. That distinction mattered to me, and it still does. I never wanted to tell this story as if an entire neighborhood was one dry afternoon away from burning to the ground, because that wasn't true and it wasn't fair. My well wasn't the only thing keeping Briar Glen safe, but it was a real, documented, structurally important part of how their fire protection system reached its designed capacity, and that fact alone explained a great deal about why Vanessa suddenly cared so much about controlling a well house she'd ignored for years. Dean also mentioned something that hadn't crossed my mind until he said it out loud. Systems like this one, built as temporary bridges between a new development and a permanent water solution, almost always come with a natural expiration point built into the original engineering plan, even if nobody bothers to write it into the legal paperwork. In most cases, once a subdivision connects fully to a municipal main and passes its final inspection, the temporary supplemental source gets formally decommissioned, the connecting pipe gets capped, and everyone moves on. Briar Glen had never done that. They'd simply kept drawing on my well year after year, quietly, without ever going back to close the loop the way the original plan intended. It didn't take long to understand her real motivation. Briar Glen was in the middle of planning a major expansion, a renovated clubhouse and an additional block of homes, and that kind of project typically triggers a formal infrastructure review from the county. If inspectors discovered that the association's fire protection plan depended on a water source they didn't legally control, The board could be forced to fund an expensive upgrade, a bigger tank, a new booster system, or a costly extension of the city main. Vanessa clearly didn't want to pay for any of that. What she wanted was to quietly convert a 14-year-old temporary arrangement into something that looked, on paper and in practice, a lot like permanent ownership. And if I pushed back against that plan, she had already positioned herself to paint me as the villain, the difficult neighbor threatening public safety over a piece of pipe. Dean looked at the photos I'd taken of the new lock and shook his head slowly. If they're presenting themselves as having control over that pump house, he said, the fire marshal is eventually going to want to see the paperwork behind that claim. I asked him what would happen if that paperwork didn't exist. He just looked at me and said Vanessa Halbrook was going to have a very long day. I learned later, through Lydia, that Vanessa had actually pitched the clubhouse expansion to the board almost a full year before that padlock ever went up, and the numbers she'd presented depended heavily on Briar Glen avoiding any major infrastructure spending in the near term. A new independent water source, the kind Chief Sloan would eventually require, carried a price tag that could have swallowed the entire expansion budget twice over. Rather than go back to the board and admit the fire protection plan rested on shakier ground than anyone realized, Vanessa apparently decided it would be simpler to just tighten her grip on the well quietly and hope nobody outside the association ever asked too many questions. She didn't wait around for that day to arrive on its own. Within a week, the association sent a mass email to every household in Briar Glen, framing the situation as a dispute with an unnamed neighboring landowner who was allegedly threatening access to a critical water resource. My name wasn't printed anywhere in that email, but everyone in that neighborhood knew exactly who she meant, since I was the only landowner sharing a property line with their development. Vanessa had built the narrative carefully, positioning the association as the protector of public safety and me as the obstacle standing in its way. A few residents started slowing their cars as they drove past my fence line, staring like they expected to catch me tearing out pipe with a wrench. Someone stopped their vehicle long enough to ask me, in a tone that wasn't remotely friendly, why I would want to shut off water meant for fighting fires. I didn't respond publicly to any of it. Nora advised strongly against turning this into some kind of shouting match in front of the neighborhood, and instead we sent a short, factual letter addressed to the entire board rather than to Vanessa personally. I had never blocked the association's access to fire water under the terms of the original agreement. It was the association that had locked the property owner out of his own equipment. Vanessa kept pushing anyway. She announced publicly that the board had the authority to replace any locks on infrastructure it considered essential for community safety, framing it as basic due diligence rather than what it actually was. What she didn't know, and what she should have anticipated given how these things usually unravel, was that Lydia Crane, the association's treasurer, had started asking uncomfortable questions of her own. Who had approved the purchase and installation of that new lock? Who had approved the signage? Which attorney, exactly, had told the board that the association held any ownership claim over a well house sitting on someone else's deeded land? Vanessa couldn't produce a clean paper trail for any of it. There was no board vote authorizing the lock. There was no resolution referencing legal advice about ownership. Lydia dug further and found something even more troubling, buried in the recent expansion paperwork the board had submitted to the county planning office. Under existing infrastructure, the application listed something called existing fire water supply, HOA-controlled, as part of the justification for moving forward with the new construction. That was a serious claim to make in an official document, and it was a claim the association had absolutely no legal basis to support, since there was no deed, no permanent easement, and no formal transfer of ownership anywhere in their files. Lydia later told me she almost didn't say anything at first, worried it might just be a clerical mistake or sloppy wording from whoever drafted the application. But the more she compared it against the actual agreement my father had signed, the more obvious it became that this wasn't an accident. Someone had made a deliberate choice to describe a 14-year-old temporary favor as though it were a permanent, fully owned asset of the association, and that someone had a very clear motive for wanting county officials to believe exactly that. 3 days after that email went out to the neighborhood, an SUV from the county fire department pulled up outside the well house, and Chief Everett Sloan stepped out with a clipboard and a calm, unreadable expression. Vanessa arrived almost immediately after, likely tipped off by someone on her side who'd spotted the vehicle. Chief Sloan looked at the lock for a long moment before he asked, simply, where the owner of the pump house was. Vanessa pointed straight at me. Sloan looked at me, then back at the lock, then asked the question that mattered most. Then why doesn't he have a key to his own equipment? That was the moment everything started to turn, though I didn't fully appreciate it until later. Chief Sloan wasn't there to take sides in a neighborhood feud, and he made that clear within the first few minutes. He wasn't angry, he wasn't sympathetic, he was simply working through an inspection checklist with the kind of patience that comes from doing a dangerous job for a very long time. Vanessa explained that the association had assumed what she called operational management responsibilities over the water infrastructure. Sloan asked, without any particular emotion, which document authorized that arrangement. Vanessa said the association's attorney had reviewed the situation and could provide documentation. Sloan asked for a copy on the spot. He turned to me next and asked me to walk him through the history of the well and the property. I explained it in plain terms, the way I would to anyone who genuinely wanted to understand rather than score points. The well sat on land my family had owned for generations. My family had always handled the core maintenance of the pump and the main system. The association had been granted permission years earlier to draw water for fire suppression purposes only. I had never transferred, sold, or otherwise given up operational control of the well house itself. Chief Sloan studied the pipe diagram taped to the inside of the door, then asked the exact question that would end up defining this entire story. If this is Mr. Rourke's private property, he said, where does Briar Glen's hydrant reserve actually originate? Vanessa answered quickly, saying it came from the association's own system. Sloan pointed at the red line on the diagram and asked where that line began. Nobody answered right away. He turned to me instead, and I pointed down at the concrete floor beneath our feet. Right here, I told him. Sloan asked Vanessa to unlock the door so he could inspect the equipment directly, and in a moment that felt almost too perfectly ironic to be real, she was the one who produced the key while I, the actual owner, stood outside waiting for permission to enter my own building. Chief Sloan clearly registered the absurdity of that arrangement, even if his face barely changed. Inside, he examined the pump, the valves, the pressure gauges, and the line feeding out toward the Briar Glen reserve tank, along with whatever maintenance logs were kept on site. He asked when the pump had last been serviced, who had performed the service, and whether the association had ever independently inspected the equipment it claimed to be securing. Vanessa didn't have clear answers to any of those questions, and each time she hesitated, Chief Sloan simply wrote something down on his clipboard without any visible reaction, which somehow felt worse for her than if he'd shown any frustration at all. After roughly 20 minutes of careful inspection, he turned to Vanessa and asked what contingency plan the association had in place if the property owner ever chose to terminate the water-sharing arrangement entirely. Vanessa answered flatly that I couldn't do that, as if the idea itself were absurd. By then Nora had arrived, having driven out the moment I texted her that the fire chief was on site, and she calmly opened a folder and suggested Vanessa take a closer look at Section 12 of the original agreement. Vanessa's expression shifted the instant Nora read the clause aloud. Unauthorized interference with the property owner's access or equipment constitutes grounds for immediate termination of the usage rights granted under this agreement. It was right there in black and white, signed and dated 14 years earlier, and it meant that by installing that lock and blocking my access, Vanessa may have handed me the legal grounds to end the entire arrangement whenever I chose. The situation had completely reversed itself in the span of a single afternoon. I wasn't the neighbor threatening the water supply anymore. Vanessa was the one who had potentially put the association's usage rights in jeopardy through her own decision to overreach. Nora didn't push for immediate termination, and honestly, neither did I. I never wanted anyone in that neighborhood to lose fire protection because of a dispute they had no part in creating. What I wanted was simple. I wanted the association to stop acting like it owned something it had merely been permitted to borrow. Chief Sloan echoed that same sentiment in his own way, requiring that the existing system remain operational while the dispute worked its way toward resolution. But he added one more requirement that changed everything. The association needed to formally demonstrate its legal right to rely on that water source as part of its official fire protection plan, or it would need to find another way to meet its obligations entirely. That meant a new independent water source, a significantly larger reserve tank, an upgraded and expensive connection to the city main, or a properly negotiated agreement with me. None of those options were cheap, and Vanessa knew it. Within a few days, she asked to speak with me privately, away from the board, away from Chief Sloan, away from anyone taking notes. Even then, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, she couldn't quite drop the tone she'd used since the very first morning she showed up with that padlock. "Caleb," she said, "you don't actually want to be the reason hundreds of families lose their fire insurance coverage, do you?" I told her that she didn't want people finding out she'd locked the actual property owner out of the water source she'd been publicly claiming those families depended on. She went quiet for a moment, then pivoted, offering the association's money in exchange for a permanent easement, something that would settle the matter for good. I said no, and not because I was trying to squeeze more money out of the situation. The agreement she was proposing still gave the association broad rights to enter my property whenever they decided it was necessary, which was exactly the kind of overreach that had started this whole mess in the first place. "You tried to take control with a lock," I told her. "I'm not going to hand you that same control on paper instead." She sat back in her chair, quiet for a long moment, and for the first time since this whole thing started, some of that practiced confidence slipped away from her face. She asked, almost genuinely, whether I understood what would happen to the association if it couldn't secure a compliant water source in time. I told her I understood it perfectly well, and that the responsibility for fixing it belonged to the people who had spent 14 years treating a borrowed convenience like a guaranteed right, not to the landowner who had simply asked to keep the key to his own building. That night, Lydia called me at home, her voice tight with something between frustration and disbelief. She told me there was something Vanessa had never disclosed to the rest of the board. I told her I was listening. She explained that the entire clubhouse expansion project had been pitched to outside investors on the assumption that the neighborhood's fire protection system was already fully secured and legally sound, with no outstanding questions about water rights or ownership. In other words, Vanessa hadn't just been protecting the association's interests. She'd been protecting a promise she'd already made to people with money on the line, a promise built on a foundation that didn't actually exist. In the days leading up to that meeting, word had clearly spread beyond the immediate board members, because people I'd never met stopped me at the feed store and the gas station just to ask what was really going on out at the well house. I kept my answers short and factual every time, resisting the urge to editorialize or paint Vanessa in a worse light than the facts already did on their own. Nora had warned me that the moment I started sounding vindictive in public, people would start doubting my side of the story out of instinct alone, regardless of what the paperwork actually said. Lydia requested a special board meeting, and this time the turnout was much larger than usual, with residents packing into folding chairs along the back wall of the community room. Vanessa tried to control the narrative from the very first minute, describing the entire situation as a minor paperwork disagreement that had been blown out of proportion by an overly cautious neighbor. Then Chief Sloan walked in, and it was immediately clear he hadn't come to referee an association squabble. He'd come to present the actual state of the fire protection system, based entirely on what he'd documented during his own inspection. He explained, in plain and measured language, that Briar Glen did have a functioning fire protection system, but a critical component of that system's reserve capacity sat on private property, and the association had never provided documentation proving legal ownership or a secure permanent right to rely on it. The existing agreement was itself now in dispute, specifically because of the association's decision to lock the property owner out of his own equipment. A murmur spread through the room almost instantly. Vanessa tried to turn the conversation back toward me. "This is exactly what I warned everyone about," she said. "Mr. Rourke has been threatening to cut off water that this entire community depends on." Chief Sloan cut her off without raising his voice at all. "No," he said, "I have not heard Mr. Rourke say anything about shutting off water. My concern is that the association represented, in an official application, that it controlled a water source it has not been able to prove it legally controls." The room fell silent. Lydia stood up and pulled the relevant board minutes up on the projector screen at the front of the room. There was no recorded vote authorizing the new lock. There was no documented legal opinion supporting any ownership claim over the well. There was no record of any new agreement or purchase involving me at all. Dean Whitaker, who had come at Nora's request to explain the original engineering, walked the room through exactly how the system had been designed 14 years earlier. The well had been offered as a permitted, temporary solution to a real infrastructure gap. It had never been gifted, sold, or transferred to Briar Glen Estates in any form. One resident, an older woman near the front row, finally asked the question that seemed to hang over the entire room. "If Mr. Rourke owns that well, why did you lock him out of it?" Vanessa opened her mouth to answer, but nothing she said sounded even remotely convincing anymore. Lydia pulled up one more document before the meeting ended, an invoice labeled Emergency Wellhouse Security Upgrade, approved and signed by exactly one person, Vanessa Halbrook. There was no board approval attached to it, no secondary signature, nothing beyond her own authorization scrawled at the bottom of the page. A younger board member, someone who had only joined the association within the last year, asked Vanessa directly whether any of the other trustees had known about the invoice before that night. She admitted, reluctantly, that she hadn't brought it to a formal vote because she considered it an emergency measure that fell within her discretion as president. Chief Sloan, still standing near the back of the room with his clipboard tucked under one arm, noted quietly that emergency measures typically involve some kind of actual emergency, and a well that had been functioning without incident for 14 years didn't obviously qualify. The board voted that same night to suspend her operational authority while an independent review looked into every decision she'd made regarding the well house and the broader expansion project. The new lock came off the following morning, and the laminated sign disappeared not long after that. But removing a padlock didn't solve the underlying problem, and everyone in that room understood it. Briar Glen still needed a real, long-term solution to its fire protection gap, one that didn't depend on the goodwill of a neighbor who'd just had his own property used against him. Nora and I worked with the newly reorganized board to draft a fair, clearly defined replacement agreement, one that finally reflected reality instead of convenient assumptions. Under the new terms, the association could continue drawing fire suppression water from my well for a fixed, limited period, while they built proper independent infrastructure of their own. In exchange, the board had to formally acknowledge in writing that the well and the well house were, and always had been, my private property. I retained unrestricted access at all times, with no exceptions written in for anyone else's convenience. No locks could be changed by anyone other than me, under any circumstances, for any reason. The water could only be used for fire suppression and routine system testing, exactly as the original agreement had specified from the very beginning. The association was responsible for covering the electricity and a fair share of the maintenance tied directly to that usage. And most importantly, they were required to fund and build their own independent backup water source within a clearly defined time frame, with real deadlines attached. We spent almost 3 weeks going back and forth on the exact language before both sides felt comfortable signing anything, and Nora made sure every clause closed a loophole that could have let a future board president try something similar down the road. We added a requirement that any physical changes to the well house, even something as small as a new sign, needed my written approval in advance. We added a clause requiring the association to carry its own insurance covering any damage or liability connected to their use of the equipment, so that responsibility never quietly shifted back onto me. And we built in a yearly review, giving both sides a scheduled chance to raise concerns before they had the opportunity to turn into another standoff at a padlocked door. The new board approved it without much resistance, relieved, I think, to finally have clear ground to stand on instead of the vague, shifting authority Vanessa had been operating under. Vanessa herself objected loudly during the vote, but by then, she no longer held any real decision-making power within the organization, and her objections carried little weight beyond making the meeting run a bit longer than it needed to. The clubhouse expansion was formally postponed until the fire protection system could be independently verified and properly documented, which was exactly the outcome that should have happened months earlier if things had been handled honestly from the start. I want to be clear about something, because it matters to how this whole thing ended. I never shut off that water to punish anyone. I never used my position to put a single family in that neighborhood at risk, not for a day, not for an hour. All I ever wanted was for people to respect the actual boundary between being allowed to use something and being allowed to own it. Those are two very different things. And Vanessa Halbrook spent 14 years quietly blurring that line until she finally believed her own story a little too much. Dean Whitaker ended up consulting on the design of that new tank, at Lydia's suggestion, since he already understood the original system better than anyone else the association could have hired fresh. He told me later that the new setup was actually better engineered than the original stopgap ever had been, built with modern pump technology and enough reserve capacity to handle Briar Glen's planned expansion without leaning on a single outside property. It felt like a strange kind of closure, watching the very engineer who'd helped me untangle the truth about my own well go on to help build the system that would finally make that well unnecessary for anyone but me. A few months later, Briar Glen broke ground on a proper independent reserve tank, sized and engineered to meet the development's fire flow requirements without relying on my property at all. The day the engineering crew came out to survey the site for that new tank, Chief Sloan happened to be there as well, reviewing the plans one more time before signing off. He glanced over toward my well house from where he stood, noting the door hanging there without any trace of that old industrial lock. He asked me, almost offhandedly, whether I still held on to my own key. I reached into my pocket and held it up so he could see it clearly. This time I told him, yes, I do. Sometime after that, the new backup system at Briar Glen was finally finished and fully tested, and my well stopped being the only thing standing between that neighborhood and a serious gap in fire protection. The relationship between my land and the development beside it finally settled back into something reasonable, something closer to what it should have been from the very start. Neighbors remained neighbors, nothing more, nothing less. Nobody was pretending to own something that belonged to someone else, and nobody was pretending to be powerless on their own land either. Vanessa resigned from the board not long after the internal review wrapped up, once it became clear just how many decisions she'd made entirely on her own authority, without votes, without documentation, without anyone else's knowledge or consent. I don't think she was ever formally charged with anything, and honestly, I never wanted that outcome for her. There didn't need to be handcuffs or courtrooms or dramatic consequences to make this story land the way it should. The real consequence was simpler, and in its own way, far more fitting. The woman who had spent years acting as though everything beyond her side of the fence was somehow hers to control, finally lost the exact kind of authority she'd used to make people feel small. Lydia stepped into a more prominent role on the reorganized board, and from that point forward, any decision touching property outside the official boundaries of Briar Glen Estates required clear documentation and a full vote before anyone could move forward with it. Chief Sloan finished his official report on the incident and moved on to the next inspection on his list exactly the way a man like that should, without ever needing to take a side beyond the facts in front of him. As for me, I went back to the quiet rhythm of running 60 acres, tending the fields, and checking the irrigation lines the way I had long before any of this began. The morning I'm thinking of now happened not long after all the dust had settled. I walked out to the well house early, before the heat set in, and unlocked the door with my own key, the way it always should have worked. The pump ran the way it was supposed to, steady and quiet, the pressure gauge sitting exactly where it belonged. Outside, the irrigation system carried water out across the fields the way it had for decades, and off in the distance I could see the row of red hydrants lining the streets of Briar Glen, still standing exactly where they'd always stood. They're still there today, still doing their job, still ready if they're ever needed. But now everyone involved actually understands where that water comes from, and more importantly, exactly who it belongs to. Vanessa thought a single padlock would be enough to convince an entire community that the Homeowners Association controlled my well. What it actually did was force a fire chief to finally ask the one question she had managed to avoid for 14 years. If that well truly belonged to the association, then why did every piece of paper on record still say it belonged to me?